The dojo hummed with the sharp rhythm of synchronized punches, a pulse of discipline that echoed off the polished wooden walls of the Sinclair Martial Arts Academy. Beneath it all, a quieter sound, a faint drip, 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 came from the back hallway where Joe Walker crouched under a leaking sink, his calloused hands wrestling with a rusted pipe. His faded blue janitor's shirt clung to his shoulders, soaked from cold water that glistened like tears on his forearms. At 38, Joe carried the weight of years in his steady grip, a man who'd learned to fix what others broke without expecting thanks. But today, a different kind of fracture cut deeper than the pipes he mended. "Is that your daughter or your assistant?" The voice sliced through the dojo, whip sharp and smug, loud enough to turn heads but soft enough to feign innocence. Coach Mason's words weren't just a jab. They were a blade aimed to sting. Joe didn't flinch. His wrench paused mid-turn, but his eyes stayed fixed on the pipe, as if ignoring the taunt could shield the small figure beside him. Daisy, 9 years old, stood frozen at the glass pane separating the hallway from the dojo's pristine mats. Her school uniform hung loose on her slight frame, her oversized backpack slipping off one shoulder like a burden too heavy for her years. Her wide eyes, bright with a hunger she didn't yet know how to name, drank in the class. Kids in crisp white GIs, their punches snapping like firecrackers in perfect unison. She clung to the window's edge, a silent outsider yearning to belong. "Don't block the door," Mason added, his back still to her, his tone dripping with disdain. "Unless you're planning to mop the mats after practice." The words landed like a slap, and the room erupted in laughter. Not loud, but sharp, a collective snicker that sliced sideways. It was the kind of laugh that told a child she was invisible, or worse, unwelcome. Daisy's fingers tightened on the window frame, her lips pressing into a thin line, but she didn't move. Joe's heart twisted, a familiar ache from nights spent holding her after her mother's absence became permanent. He tightened the wrench one last time. The pipe hissed, then fell silent, as if it too knew when to yield. Joe rose slowly, wiping his hands on his shirt, the faded fabric a map of his labor. He stepped beside Daisy, his shadow a quiet shield. "She wasn't blocking the door," he said, his voice low but steady, like a river carving through stone. Mason finally turned, his smile too polished, too easy, like a salesman closing a deal. "Well," he said, eyes flicking over Joe's worn boots and untucked shirt, "the viewing area's for parents, Mr. Walker, not plumbers. We try to maintain a certain standard here." The word hung heavy, a judgment on Joe's calloused hands, his unpressed clothes, his very presence. Daisy's shoulders hunched slightly, her backpack slipping further, but her eyes never left the mats, as if they held a dream she refused to let go. Mason wasn't done. He glanced at his students, inviting them into his mockery. "You know, in martial arts, we teach that discipline begins with presentation. Maybe you should consider wearing a belt sometime." He paused, letting the jab sink in. "Might keep those pants up." The laughter came again, sharper now, a blade honed by repetition. A boy in the back snorted. A girl covered her mouth, her eyes darting between Joe and Daisy, embarrassed for them both. Joe's face remained still, a mask forged in harder places than this dojo. Battlefields where insults were bullets, and he'd learned to dodge both. He didn't smile, didn't flinch, just reached down and lifted Daisy's backpack, easing it onto her shoulders with a gentleness that belied his strength. "Let's go," he murmured. She nodded, her gaze lingering on the mats, a silent vow etched in her silence. They turned toward the hallway, the weight of the room's eyes heavy on their backs. But before they could cross the threshold, a voice, clear, measured, and sharp as a blade drawn from its sheath, cut through the air from above. "Coach Mason." The words were a command, not a request. "You'll apologize." Every head snapped upward. Naomi Sinclair stood at the top of the staircase, her silhouette framed against the balcony's soft light. Her black blazer and white blouse were as crisp as her tone, her posture unyielding, like a general surveying a battlefield. Her face held no expression, only the quiet authority of someone who spoke and expected obedience. Mason's smirk faltered, a crack in his polished armor. "Miss Sinclair," he said, his laugh nervous now. A man caught off guard. I was just apologizing, she interrupted, descending the stairs with deliberate grace, each step a metronome of intent. Now would be fine. Her voice was calm, but it carried the weight of a storm held at bay. Joe blinked, his breath catching. He barely knew her, glimpses from months ago, fixing a fence under her distant gaze, her presence always cool, unreadable. Today she was a force, a spark igniting something he hadn't felt in years. Mason cleared his throat, his confidence unraveling. Of course. My apologies, Mr. Walker, he said, the words stiff, mechanical. Didn't mean to offend. Joe met Naomi's gaze, then looked back at Mason. I've been insulted before, he said, his voice quiet but unyielding, like a man who'd faced worse than words and walked away whole. Doesn't bother me. Naomi reached the base of the stairs, her eyes sweeping the room, landing on the students frozen in their neat rows. I didn't ask him to apologize for your sake, she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade through silk. She turned to the class, her gaze steady. I asked him to apologize for theirs. The words hung in the air, a challenge to the room, to the laughter, to the cruelty disguised as jest. In that moment, Daisy's small hand tightened in Joe's, and he felt it. Not just her grip, but her heart, beating with a courage he hadn't taught her, but she'd somehow learned. The dojo fell silent, a hush so deep it seemed the walls themselves held their breath. Naomi Sinclair's gaze softened as she turned to Daisy, her voice a quiet beacon cutting through the tension. Do you want to learn? She asked, the question carrying a weight that transcended the mats. Daisy's eyes widened, bright with a mix of fear and longing, and she glanced at her father, seeking not permission, but courage. Joe Walker stood still, his weathered hands still damp from the pipe he'd fixed, his heart caught between pride and doubt. Coach Mason's jaw tightened, his stare fixed on the polished floor, but Joe felt the man's resentment simmering like a storm on the horizon. I'm just here to fix the leak, Joe said finally, his voice low, steady, a man anchoring himself against a tide of memory. Naomi's expression didn't shift, but her words carried a quiet fire. And I'm here to fix something else. She turned to the class, her authority a blade cloaked in silk. Everyone take a break. 10 minutes. Water? Stretch. Then to Mason, her tone clipped but deliberate. Let's discuss curriculum in my office. The words were a summons, not a request, and Mason's mechanical nod betrayed the crack in his bravado. Later, as the students dispersed, Naomi's eyes found Joe again. Her voice softened, not in pitch but in the weight it carried, like a hand extended across a chasm. She can observe the class for now, she said, glancing at Daisy, whose small frame seemed to grow under the offer. If you're all right with it. Joe nodded once, a gesture heavy with unspoken gratitude. Naomi offered the faintest smile, a flicker of warmth that vanished as she turned away, her heels clicking against the hardwood. The moment dissolved, but its echo lingered, a promise unspoken. Daisy tugged at Joe's sleeve, her whisper bright with awe. Dad, she's amazing. Joe's lips curved, a rare smile breaking through the stoic lines of his face. She's something, all right. He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, don't tell her that belt joke was kind of funny. Daisy's giggle was a spark in the dim hallway, light and unburdened. I won't, she promised, her eyes dancing. But you almost laughed. Almost, Joe conceded, resting a gentle hand on her back, guiding her to a bench at the room's edge. The class resumed, but Mason's voice, once sharp as a whip, now carried a muted edge, as if the air itself had shifted. Daisy sat up straight, no longer pressed against the window like an outsider. Her eyes, wide and alive, tracked every movement on the mats. Not with envy, but with the quiet certainty of someone who'd found a door, cracked open, waiting for her to step through. 2 days later, under a sky heavy with steel-gray clouds, Joe knelt outside the Sinclair Martial Arts Academy, adjusting the straps of Daisy's borrowed GI. The fabric hung loose on her small frame, sleeves rolled up twice, a symbol of her determination outsizing her body. The afternoon air felt thick, oppressive, as if the world itself pressed down on them. You don't have to do this, Joe said, his voice soft, laced with a father's hesitation, a fear that this step might ask too much of her fragile courage. Daisy looked up, her chin trembling but her gaze steady, a spark of defiance in her eyes. "I want to," she said, the words a vow, small but unshakable. Joe nodded, his throat tight, and stood as she faced the dojo's double doors, her nervous energy radiating like heat from a flame. Inside, the dojo thrummed with life, bare feet thumping against polished mats, hushed instructions weaving through the air like a quiet melody. Naomi stood near her office, clipboard in hand, her sharp-cut suit a contrast to the soft intensity of her conversation with Master Kenji, an older man whose shaved head and stone-like stillness commanded the room's respect. His movements were rare, but when they came, the air seemed to pause, as if acknowledging a deeper wisdom. At the far end, Coach Mason oversaw a line of students warming up, his smile polished but hollow, a mask slipping under scrutiny. Emily, a senior student with a dark braid swinging like a pendulum, spotted Daisy and jogged over, her grin warm and genuine. "Hey, Daisy, right on time." She nodded to Joe, her confidence a quiet reassurance. "I'll take care of her." Joe hesitated, his hand lingering on Daisy's shoulder, a father's instinct wrestling with trust. Emily knelt to Daisy's level, her voice bright with encouragement. "You ready to show these guys what you got?" Daisy's nervous grin broke through, real and unguarded, and she followed Emily onto the mat, a small shadow among the sea of crisp uniforms. "She has your walk," Naomi said softly, her voice so quiet Joe almost missed it. He turned, finding her beside him, arms crossed, her gaze fixed on Daisy with an intensity that felt like recognition. "My walk?" he asked, puzzled, his brow furrowing. "That quiet confidence," Naomi replied, her words deliberate, "like she belongs, even when no one invited her." Joe glanced back at the mat, where Daisy moved tentatively, her small form dwarfed but unbowed. "She didn't get that from me," he said, his voice tinged with doubt. "She just doesn't know when to be scared yet." Naomi tilted her head, her eyes sharp but kind. "Or maybe she knows and walks anyway." The words hung between them, a bridge untraveled, fragile but real. Silence settled, not awkward, but heavy with possibility. "Thank you," Joe said finally, the words raw, unguarded. "For what?" Naomi asked, her voice steady but curious. "For seeing her," he said, "for not turning her away." Naomi paused, her gaze flickering to the mat, where Daisy mirrored Emily's movements. "I didn't do it for charity, Joe," she said, her voice dropping, a confession wrapped in resolve. "There's something broken in that room. I just hadn't realized how badly until she looked through that window." Joe studied her, catching the faint crack in her voice, the way she spoke of the dojo not as a building, but as a vow she'd failed to keep. "You built this place, didn't you?" he asked, his tone gentle but probing. She nodded, her eyes distant. "My husband did. I funded it." Her voice held steady, but beneath it lay a wound, raw and real. He wanted a place where kids learned not just how to fight, but how not to, where a belt wasn't about power but progress. She exhaled, the sound heavy with regret. "And now?" "Now it's a business," she said, her gaze sharpening as it landed on Mason, barking commands across the room like a drill sergeant. "Rankings, medals, speed, appearances." Joe followed her gaze. "He runs it like a boot camp." Naomi's eyes narrowed, a spark of defiance flaring. "He was a state champion, charismatic, got results. The parents loved him." Her voice dropped, almost to herself. "But I stopped listening to my gut the day I signed the transfer of authority papers." Joe crossed his arms, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "Your gut might have needed a louder wrench." The quip drew a quiet laugh from Naomi, raw and unguarded, the first time Joe saw her shed the polished mask of the executive. For a moment she was just a woman, tired, trying, human. She glanced at him, her eyes searching. "You didn't even blink when he humiliated you. Why?" Joe looked down, his voice low, steady, like a man who'd faced worse than words. "Because if I reacted, she'd remember that longer than the insult." The truth of it hung between them, a father's sacrifice laid bare. Naomi's gaze softened, a flicker of admiration in her eyes. That's rare. It shouldn't be, Joe said, his voice firm but quiet. But it is. They stood in silence, the dojo's rhythm pulsing around them. On the mat, Emily guided Daisy through a slow series of movements. Daisy stumbled, her small frame wobbling, but she caught herself, her eyes flicking to Joe. He gave her a subtle thumbs up, and her back straightened, her resolve a quiet fire. Naomi followed his gaze. She's going to be good, she said, her voice certain. Joe's lips curved faintly. She already is. She just doesn't know it yet. Naomi's phone buzzed, but she didn't move, her eyes still on Daisy. Coach Mason wants to schedule a private demonstration next week, she said, her tone distant. Says it'll showcase the Academy's superiority. Joe raised an eyebrow, his voice dry. Sounds like he wants revenge. Naomi didn't respond, her gaze fixed on Daisy, lost in thought. Let him talk for now, she said finally, her voice carrying a quiet resolve. Joe studied her, sensing the shift in her, the stirrings of a plan unformed, but brewing. You've got something in mind, he said. She met his eyes fully, a spark of defiance dancing there. Not yet, she said, but I have something better. What's that? Naomi's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. Questions I'm finally ready to ask. Joe chuckled, the sound low and warm. Those tend to be more dangerous than answers. Exactly, she said, turning toward the hallway. She paused, glancing back over her shoulder. By the way, I don't think your pants need a belt. Joe grinned, the weight of the moment lifting. I'll let Coach Mason know. She disappeared through the door, the soft click of it closing like a period at the end of a sentence. Joe turned back to Daisy, now balancing on the mat, her movements wobbly but determined. Each time she stumbled, she rose faster, not out of defiance, but faith, a belief in herself that Joe hadn't taught her, but she'd somehow found. For the first time in years, a flicker stirred in his chest, not anger or regret, but something he thought he'd buried long ago under grief and grease-stained coveralls. Hope. In the locker room 2 days later, Emily's whisper cut through the dim light like a blade, sharp with concern. You sure you want to go through with this? Joe stood before a scuffed mirror, adjusting the collar of his old training gi, its faded gray-blue fabric creased from years folded in a closet, a relic of a life he'd left behind. The small patch on the shoulder, where a team logo once stood, was now just a shadow like the man he used to be. The locker room's dim light cast long shadows across the scuffed mirror, where Joe Walker stood, adjusting the collar of his old training gi. The faded gray-blue fabric, creased from years folded in the back of a closet, clung to him like a memory he wasn't sure he deserved. A faint outline on the shoulder, where a team logo once stood proud, now lingered as a ghost, a reminder of battles fought and buried. Emily's whisper cut through the quiet, sharp with concern. You sure you want to go through with this? Joe tied his belt slowly, each knot a deliberate act, his fingers steady despite the storm in his chest. I'm not here for a trophy, he said, meeting her eyes in the mirror's reflection. I'm here for a seat, for my daughter at that table. Emily's brow furrowed, puzzled, but Joe's gaze held a quiet fire, a father's resolve to carve a place for Daisy in a world that had tried to shut her out. Outside, the Sinclair Martial Arts Academy buzzed with anticipation, the echo of gathering students bouncing off the dojo's polished walls. Today was Coach Mason's demonstration, a calculated flex of dominance dressed up as training. Naomi Sinclair had agreed, but with a condition. No backroom sparring, no politics, just truth laid bare on the mats, in front of everyone. Spectators filled the benches lining the perimeter, parents whispering, students shifting, even Master Kenji seated with a folded blanket across his lap. His stillness a quiet anchor in the room. Joe stepped barefoot into the center, his walk not that of a fighter, but of a man reclaiming something long buried, a spark he thought he'd lost to grief and time. Across from him, Coach Mason stood crisp in his white gi, black belt gleaming like a badge of authority. His smile was tight, predatory, the kind that said, I've already won, and the crowd's just here to watch you fall. Glad you showed up. Mason said, his voice light but loud enough for the audience to catch, dripping with mockery. I was worried you'd be too busy unclogging drains. A ripple of chuckles spread from the back, sharp and unkind, but Joe didn't respond. He simply bowed, the gesture steeped in respect, though his eyes held a quiet challenge. Mason's bow was sharp, mechanical, a formality stripped of soul. Naomi stepped forward, clipboard in hand, her presence commanding the room like a storm held at bay. This is a controlled demonstration, she said, her voice clear, unyielding. No strikes to the head, no submissions unless verbal. Stop when commanded. Clear? Both men nodded, and she stepped back, her gaze unreadable. Begin. For a heartbeat, the dojo was still, the air thick with tension. Joe stood relaxed, his stance open, while Mason's was taut, his feet dancing lightly, shoulders loose but calculated, a showman's poise. Then with sudden ferocity, Mason lunged, his spinning kick slicing through the air. Textbook perfect, a blur of practiced speed. Joe didn't counter. He stepped aside, not with panic but with precision, the kick missing by inches. Another followed. Hook, punch, jab, side kick, all fluid, all fast. Joe didn't touch him. He dodged, his movements minimal. No flash, only clarity, like a man who danced this dance in darker places. The crowd leaned in, their breaths held, the room's energy shifting. At the mat's edge, Daisy sat beside Emily, her eyes wide, her small hands clutching the bench. Why isn't he fighting back? She whispered, her voice trembling with worry. Emily's gaze stayed fixed on Joe, a quiet confidence in her tone. Because he doesn't need to yet. Mason's strikes grew quicker, heavier, his breathing deepening, his brows knitting, not in focus, but frustration. Joe moved like a shadow, untouchable, his silence not cowardice but discipline, a mastery honed in places where ego had no place. The dojo fell quiet, the absence of cheers or commentary, leaving only the soft scuff of bare feet and the rhythm of breath. Then Mason overreached, his left leg arcing high, aiming for Joe's shoulder in a flashy display. But Joe wasn't there. He'd stepped inside the arc, his left hand barely grazing Mason's center of balance, and Mason stumbled, not from a blow, but from absence, the space where his opponent should have been simply gone. Mason caught himself, spinning sharply, his jaw clenched, sweat beading on his brow. You afraid to hit me? He snapped, his chest heaving, his voice raw with desperation. Joe's response was calm, but it carried across the silent dojo like a bell. I'm afraid I might teach you something you're not ready to learn. Gasps rippled through the crowd, a few quiet whistles breaking the tension. Naomi folded her arms, her expression a mask, but her eyes flickered with something, pride perhaps, or recognition. Mason roared, charging with raw fury, his movements less show now, more desperation. Joe met him not with force, but with flow, a shift, a sidestep, a redirection of energy. And then, so swiftly some might have missed it, Joe hooked behind Mason's knee, his palm grazing Mason's chest, and let gravity do the rest. Mason hit the mat with a flat thud, the sound echoing like a verdict. Silence swallowed the room. Joe didn't gloat, didn't raise a fist. He stepped back and bowed, his respect unshaken. Mason lay there a moment too long, his face flushed, sweat clinging to his jawline. Naomi moved to the center, her voice steady. This demonstration is concluded. She looked at Mason, her gaze piercing. Would you like to say anything? Mason sat up, his voice cracked, barely audible. No. Naomi nodded once. Very well. She turned to Joe, her eyes softening, though her tone remained firm. You didn't come here to prove something. Joe glanced at Daisy, her small face alight with awe, then back at Naomi. No, he said, his voice quiet but resolute. I came to show her. You don't have to be loud to be heard. Naomi's eyes flickered, a crack in her guarded facade, and she stepped aside, gesturing toward the exit. Joe offered Mason a hand, helping him to his feet with the same quiet strength he'd shown on the mat. In that gesture, not a move, but a moment, something shifted. Respect, not won through dominance, but restored through restraint. As Joe walked back to Daisy, the audience's applause began. Not loud, not theatrical, but real, rising like a tide. Deep within Naomi's chest, beneath layers of logic and detachment, a warmth stirred, a belief not in victory, but in possibility. The garage was a sanctuary of silence, broken only by the soft ticking of cooling metal. Joe stood at his workbench, sleeves rolled up, engine oil staining the cracks of his knuckles like battle scars. An old radiator hissed faintly, struggling to warm the cramped space. Daisy's half-repaired bicycle leaned against the wall, a project paused like so many things in his life. On a shelf above, a dusty photo of Elise, her soft eyes and crooked smile frozen in time, watched over him. He hadn't touched that frame in years, as if its weight might unravel him. Outside, October's chill settled over the town, the wind howling low, carrying the bite of approaching winter. Daisy had gone to bed early, exhausted but glowing from practice, her words spilling like light as she recounted Emily's encouragement, Naomi's quiet approval. "She said I had balance," Daisy had beamed. "She said I listened." Joe had listened too, smiling in the dark as her voice faded mid-sentence, sleep claiming her. Now alone he reached for the photo, his fingers brushing the dust that clung to the glass like a memory too heavy to shake. "She would have loved this," a voice said, soft but clear, from the doorway. Joe turned. Naomi stood there, her coat drawn tight against the cold, her heels tapping softly on the concrete as she stepped inside. Her eyes swept the cluttered shelves, the old tools, the faded navy mug by the sink, taking in the pieces of a life built from grit and grief. "How did you find me?" Joe asked, his voice low, guarded. "I asked Emily," Naomi said simply. "Told her I had a delivery for her coach." Joe raised an eyebrow, a faint spark of curiosity breaking through. "And what are you delivering?" Naomi reached into her bag, pulling out a leather-bound notebook, its edges worn, its weight heavy with history. She held it out with both hands, not as a gift, but as a truth laid bare. "This was my husband's," she said, her voice steady but laced with something raw. "His training journal from college, notes, diagrams, philosophies, some personal, some painful." Joe didn't reach for it, his eyes locked on hers, searching. "I don't need a manual," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "It's not a manual," Naomi replied, her voice softening, a quiet insistence. "It's a map." A pause hung between them, heavy with unspoken things. Joe took the notebook gently, its leather soft and aged under his fingers. He opened it, the faded ink trailing across the first page. "A black belt is just a white belt who never stopped showing up." The words hit like a punch he hadn't braced for, and he swallowed hard, his throat tight. Naomi's gaze drifted to the photo on the shelf. "Is that her?" Joe nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Her name was Elise." "She looks kind," Naomi said, her tone gentle, reverent. "She was," Joe murmured, his eyes distant, lost in memory. "She lit up rooms, sharp as a blade but warm, the kind of woman who made you feel 5 seconds behind, but glad to chase her light." Naomi smiled faintly, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. "What happened?" Joe ran a hand over his jaw, the weight of the question pressing against old wounds. "She got sick," he said, his voice low, steady, but cracked at the edges. "At first it was just fatigue, then coughing. We didn't know how bad it was. One night I drove her to the ER. They misdiagnosed, sent us home." He paused, his eyes darkening, the memory a shadow that never faded. 3 hours later, she collapsed, internal bleeding. By the time they got her back to the hospital, it was too late. Naomi stood motionless in the dim garage, her breath caught in the weight of Joe's words. His voice, raw and cracked like a string stretched beyond its breaking point, carried the kind of vulnerability that didn't diminish a man, but made him taller, as if his scars were pillars holding up the truth. Joe met her gaze, his eyes unguarded, reflecting a grief that had carved itself into his bones. "I fought in places most people can't pronounce," he said, his voice low, steady despite the tremor. "I've stopped men from dying with nothing but a pen and adrenaline. But that night, I couldn't save my wife in a hospital 30 minutes from our house. Naomi stepped closer, her presence a quiet anchor in the storm of his confession. And you think that disqualifies you from helping now? She asked, her voice gentle but piercing, cutting through the haze of his self-doubt. Joe shook his head, his jaw tight, as if holding back a flood. I think it disqualifies me from pretending I have anything worth teaching. His words were heavy, each one a stone laid on the grave of a man he used to be. Naomi didn't argue. Instead, she drifted to the corner of the garage, her fingers brushing the workbench, tracing the worn edges as if reconnecting with a forgotten friend. She turned, her eyes sharp with a truth she'd long avoided. You know what scares me most? She asked, her voice soft but resolute. Joe raised an eyebrow, his curiosity a flicker in the dim light. What? That I built something my husband would hate, she said, her words cutting through the silence like a blade through silk. I thought I was preserving his dream, but I let the wrong people take it over. I called it leadership. It was avoidance. Her gaze dropped, her fingers tightening around the edge of her coat, as if anchoring herself against the weight of her own regret. And you? You think staying out of the ring protects Daisy? What if showing her your scars is the very thing that gives her strength? The words hung in the air, solid, unshakable, like a truth too long buried. Outside, a branch tapped the window, a quiet knock carried by the October wind. Joe set the leather-bound journal down gently, its pages whispering of promises unkept. She deserves better than the broken pieces of me, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, heavy with a father's fear. Naomi met his gaze, her eyes fierce with conviction. Then show her how to build with them. The line lingered, a beacon in the dark, and for a moment, neither spoke. Naomi straightened her coat, her movements deliberate, as if reclaiming her resolve. I won't stay, she said, her voice soft but firm. I just wanted you to have that journal. Maybe it helps, maybe it doesn't, but it's not doing any good collecting dust in my drawer. Joe nodded, his voice low, almost reverent. Thank you. Aranamim, as she reached the door, Naomi paused, her silhouette framed against the cold night. For what it's worth, she said without turning, I think you've already started teaching again, even if you don't realize it. She stepped into the dark, leaving Joe alone with the journal, its open page glowing under the dim bulb. He traced his fingers over the words underlined 3 times. Teach them to stand, then teach them when not to. His eyes drifted to Daisy's sleeping bag in the next room, her small form curled under the weight of dreams. For the first time in years, Joe allowed himself a flicker of possibility. Not redemption, but return. Saturday morning at the Sinclair Martial Arts Academy felt different, the air heavy with an unspoken shift. The usual machine-like precision, timed drills, squeaky clean mats, Coach Mason's voice slicing through the corridors like a metronome, was absent. Naomi sensed it before she saw it, a quiet that wasn't peaceful but charged like the hush before a storm. The laughter of younger students didn't echo as it once did. Older ones avoided her gaze, their eyes lingering on the floor. Something had changed, and it wasn't just Joe. It was the dojo itself, stirring awake from a long slumber. In the observation room, Naomi stood among a handful of parents, their murmurs fading as they watched Joe on the mat. He guided Emily and 3 intermediate students through a counter-rotation drill, his movements unhurried, unflashy, but magnetic. The students listened, shoulders relaxed, eyes locked on him, not out of fear but focus, as if he spoke to something deeper than technique. Naomi watched, her breath catching at the quiet authority in his presence. Joe adjusted a boy's stance, his voice calm but firm. Don't push the force back, he said. Absorb it. Let it pass through. Turn it into something else. The boy nodded, tried again, and improved. Joe's small nod of approval was a spark, igniting confidence. Emily approached between drills, brushing sweat from her brow, her braids swinging. He doesn't teach like Mason, she said, her voice low, reverent. Naomi's lips curved slightly. What do you mean? He teaches like he remembers what it's like to be bad at something, Emily said, her words landing like a quiet truth, heavier than Naomi expected. She scanned the dojo again, her gut tightening. Mason was nowhere to be seen. "Where is he?" she asked. Emily hesitated. "Didn't show. First time in months. Did he call?" "No, just gone." Naomi's breath caught, a cold certainty settling in her chest. She moved swiftly down the hall to Mason's office, the door slightly ajar. Inside, papers were missing. A drawer gaped open. A filing cabinet stood empty. Her heart sank, the betrayal sharp and silent. At the main entrance, she caught Master Kenji stepping out of his car, his movements slow with age but his eyes sharp as ever, cutting through the morning chill. "I need to talk to you," Naomi said quietly. Kenji bowed slightly, his gaze knowing. "Let me guess. You found the crack." Naomi blinked, startled. "What?" Kenji walked beside her toward the back hallway, his voice steady, like a river over stone. "I told your husband once, a dojo isn't made of wooden belts. It's made of silence. Where there's fear, it echoes. Where there's peace, it holds." He paused, his eyes piercing. "Lately, this place has been too loud." Naomi stopped, her voice tight. "Did you know Mason was planning to leave?" Kenji nodded once. "He already left. He just didn't tell you yet." "But why?" she pressed, her frustration rising. Kenji's gaze stripped away excuses. "Because he knew the tide had turned." The hallway buzzed faintly with the thuds of sparring practice behind them. Naomi leaned against the wall, her eyes tracing a hairline crack in the drywall, nearly invisible but undeniable. "I thought I was holding everything together," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Kenji's smile was small, wise. "You were. That's why it cracked where you couldn't see." In the training room, Joe had finished the drill, kneeling to help a young girl, no older than 6, retie her belt. "Like this," he said gently, guiding her small hands to loop and cross. "Not too tight. You're here to breathe, not battle." Her giggle was a bright note in the quiet, and Naomi watched, her heart stirring with something she hadn't felt in years. Hope, fragile but real. Kenji followed her gaze. "He teaches like a man who once forgot how to heal," he said, "and remembered through someone else's hands." Naomi's eyes softened, a quiet ache surfacing. A small voice broke the moment. Daisy, standing in the doorway, clutching a flyer. "Miss Sinclair," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. Naomi turned and Daisy held up the paper. "Coach Joe said I should ask you before signing up." Naomi took the flyer. "Local Youth Invitational Open Sparring Showcase." She looked at Daisy, her voice gentle. "You want to compete?" Daisy hesitated, her eyes bright with resolve. "Not to win," she said, "just to not be afraid." Naomi crouched, meeting her gaze. "You know, when I was your age, I stood at the edge of a diving board for 23 minutes. Didn't jump. They had to come get me." Daisy's eyes widened. "Really?" Naomi nodded, her smile solemn but warm. "I cried all the way down the ladder, but I came back the next day, and the day after that." "Did you ever jump?" Daisy asked, her voice small but curious. "Eventually," Naomi said, her smile widening. "It wasn't graceful, but it was mine." Daisy's grin was small but fierce, a spark of courage. Naomi signed the form, her signature a quiet promise. Back on the mat, Daisy returned, and Joe caught Naomi's glance. She raised the signed paper, a silent signal of trust. Joe's faint nod carried approval, gratitude, and something warmer. Connection, unspoken but undeniable. That evening, Naomi stood alone at the dojo's edge. The lights dimmed, the voices gone. The space her husband had dreamed of had been a mausoleum to grief, its walls heavy with loss. But now it was breathing again, stirring with life. Joe walked in, gym bag in hand, his presence steady, grounding. "I heard Mason cleaned out his office," he said. Naomi nodded, her voice quiet. "No note, no call." Joe shrugged, his tone matter of fact. "Sometimes people disappear when they lose the mirror they're used to seeing themselves in." Naomi leaned against the doorframe, her gaze distant. "He hated that you never hit him." Joe raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "That's why I didn't." She smiled, a soft, genuine curve of her lips. "This place doesn't need saving," she said quietly. "It needs remembering." Joe set his gym bag down, the soft thud echoing in the quiet dojo, his eyes searching Naomi's with a question that carried no pressure, only possibility. "You ever think about starting over?" he asked, his voice low. Not a challenge, but an invitation. To rebuild the dojo, perhaps, or something deeper, unspoken. Naomi looked up, her breath catching at the weight of it, the idea of a fresh beginning shimmering like a distant star. She didn't answer, didn't walk away. Her silence was its own kind of yes, a fragile thread weaving between them, golden and alive in the dim light of the Sinclair Martial Arts Academy. The morning of the Youth Invitational dawned with the stillness of a held breath, the air charged with anticipation. Outside the community gymnasium, parents clutched coffee cups with jittery hands, their murmurs blending with the restless energy of kids in crisp G's, shadowboxing the air or bouncing on their toes. Inside, the mats gleamed under stark stadium lights, their sheen a silent challenge. Bleachers creaked as they filled, the crowd a mosaic of hope and nerves. A banner stretched across the back wall, integrity over victory, its words bold, unyielding, a testament to Naomi's insistence that this day be about more than trophies. Joe knelt beside Daisy in the warm-up area, his calloused fingers adjusting her belt with a tenderness that belied his strength. Her GI, still too big, hung loose, but her eyes burned with determination. "You don't have to prove anything today," he said softly, his voice a steady anchor in the storm of her nerves. Daisy shook her head, her small jaw set. "I'm not trying to prove," she said, her voice fierce, honest, carrying a spark Joe recognized as Elise's. "I just want to remember that I'm not afraid of trying anymore." Joe blinked, stunned, her words a quiet thunder in his chest. He smiled, his eyes warm with pride. "That's braver than anything I ever did in uniform." From the stands, Naomi watched, arms folded, her usual armor of sharp suits traded for jeans and a slate gray jacket. Today, she needed no defenses, her presence softened by the moment's weight. Beside her, Master Kenji sat, his stillness a quiet wisdom, his eyes tracking the scene with nothing to prove. The first rounds erupted, quick, chaotic bursts of nervous energy, shouts and applause ringing through the gym. When Daisy's name was called, halfway through the rotation, the air seemed to tighten. She stood, bowed, and stepped onto the mat, her small frame dwarfed by her opponent, a boy a head taller, broader, his movements polished with experience. Joe's hand curled instinctively into a fist, then relaxed, his whisper a mantra to himself. "Let her work. Let her breathe." The bell rang, sharp and clear. Daisy circled, light on her feet, not rushing, her eyes sharp with focus. The boy advanced, testing her with quick jabs. She dodged once, twice, then stumbled, her small body hitting the mat with a soft thud. The crowd murmured, a collective intake of breath. Joe rose instinctively, his heart lurching, but Naomi's gentle touch on his arm stopped him. "She's not broken," she said quietly, her voice a steady hand in the chaos. Daisy sat up, her movements slow, deliberate. She rose to her knees, bowed to her opponent, and stood again, her small frame unbowed. The referee nodded, and the match resumed. The next minute was a blur, not of flawless technique, but of perfect presence. Daisy's every move a testament to courage over skill. She didn't win on points, didn't win at all, but when the final bell rang, the boy offered his hand. Daisy took it firmly, her chin high, and bowed without looking down. As she walked off the mat, the room's applause rose, quiet but real, a tribute to her resilience. In the warm-up area, Joe knelt, opening his arms. Daisy collapsed into them, her breath shaky. "I fell," she whispered, her voice small but unbroken. He kissed the top of her head, his voice thick with emotion. "Yeah, and then you stood back up." She clung to him a moment longer, then pulled back, wiping her nose on her sleeve. "Do you think Mom would have been proud?" Joe's smile trembled, his eyes glassy. "She's clapping louder than all of us right now." Across the gym, a volunteer handed Naomi a sealed envelope. She opened it, her eyes scanning the words once. Then again, her face stilling. Master Kenji leaned in, his voice low. "Everything okay?" Naomi didn't answer immediately, her fingers tightening on the paper. Mason filed a formal complaint, she said finally, her voice a whisper. Against me and Joe. Says we're corrupting teaching standards, undermining rank hierarchy. Kenji's frown deepened, his breath a slow exhale. Cowards always write letters when they lose the room. Naomi met his gaze, her jaw tight. He also filed with the board. They'll review it next week. Kenji nodded, his eyes steady. Then we give them something worth reviewing. She folded the paper, her gaze drifting to Joe and Daisy across the gym, their soft laughter a quiet rebellion against the looming threat. I'm not losing this place, she said, her voice barely audible but fierce. Kenji's smile was small, knowing. You're not. You're finally leading it. Later, as the crowd thinned and volunteers rolled up mats, Joe approached Naomi near the supply cart, his steps steady, his presence grounding. You did good today, he said, his voice warm with respect. Naomi raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk playing on her lips. I didn't throw a single punch. You didn't need to, Joe replied, leaning against the wall beside her. You let a little girl's bravery speak louder than any black belt. Naomi looked at him, her eyes searching his face, seeing the man beneath the janitor's coveralls. They're going to come after us harder now. Joe shrugged, his gaze steady. Let them. I've already lost what mattered most. I'm not afraid of paperwork. Naomi turned to him, her expression softening, a quiet vulnerability surfacing. Why are you still here, Joe? He paused, the question sinking deep, then answered, his voice raw but certain. Because I finally feel like I am. The silence between them was a living thing, a golden thread stretched tight, shimmering with possibility. Naomi broke it with a soft laugh, her eyes glinting. You know, the first time I met you, I thought you were just another ghost in coveralls. Joe chuckled, the sound warm, unguarded. And you were the ice queen with a clipboard. She nodded, her smile wry. Still got the clipboard? He looked at her, his gaze serious now, steady. Yeah, but the ice melted. Their eyes locked, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them. No kiss, no grand gesture, just two souls stepping an inch closer, their connection a quiet fire in the gathering dusk. Outside, snow began to fall, soft flurries dusting the world in white, like feathers drifting from a heaven that watched in silence. The conference room reeked of lemon cleaner and tension, its polished oak table gleaming like a mirror under the harsh fluorescent lights. 3 men and 1 woman sat across from Naomi, their matching notebooks and neutral expressions a wall of bureaucracy, ready to silence a story before it could be told. The Sinclair Martial Arts Academy logo hung on a canvas behind them, lifeless, indifferent, as if it had forgotten its own heartbeat. Naomi sat flanked by Joe and Master Kenji, her deep navy suit and low bun a shield of steel and resolve. There was no room for softness here, only truth, and she wore it like armor forged in fire. Mr. Granger, head of the Regional Martial Arts Accreditation Board, cleared his throat, his fingers steepled with practiced authority. We've reviewed the complaint filed by Mr. Mason, he began, his voice clipped, measured. It alleges improper instructional leadership, deviation from standard curriculum, and unauthorized restructuring of rank assessments. Naomi's voice was calm, a blade cloaked in velvet. We're not here to dispute the changes, she said, her eyes steady, unyielding. We're here to explain why they were necessary. Granger leaned back, his gaze narrowing. Miss Sinclair, your dojo has operated under traditional hierarchy for over 20 years. What gives you the authority to abandon that structure? Naomi didn't flinch, her response sharp and clear. The same thing that gave me the authority to uphold it for the last 10 years. Results. Joe shifted slightly, not from discomfort, but readiness, his plain clothes belying the quiet strength in his posture. He sat tall, a man who'd learned to speak without shouting, his presence a testament to battles fought in silence. Granger turned to him, his tone pointed. Mr. Walker, you were brought in without formal accreditation. You've been leading classes, evaluating students, even performing belt assessments. Isn't that irregular? Joe nodded once, his gaze steady, unflinching under the scrutiny of the Regional Martial Arts Board. "Yes, sir, it is," he said, his voice measured, a quiet ripple in the sterile conference room. The board members leaned forward expecting more, but Joe paused, letting the silence carry weight. "But I don't think kids care about what's on paper," he continued, his tone deliberate, each word a stone dropped into still water. "They care if you show up, if you see them, if you make them better, not just at kicking or punching, but at standing up when it's easier to stay down." His words landed like a quiet thunder, resonating in the room's polished confines, a truth forged in years of battles fought beyond the mats. Ms. Lee, the youngest board member, leaned in, her eyes sharp with skepticism. "But without regulation, how do we ensure consistency? How do we know you're not diluting the integrity of the art?" Joe met her gaze directly, his voice steady, carrying the weight of a life lived in service. "I spent 12 years in the Navy, trained in more countries than I can name. Under mosquito nets, on frozen dirt, in silence broken only by breath and bruises. Every one of those places had more integrity than a dozen spotless gyms where kids are told they don't belong because their shoes aren't new." His words cut deep, a blade of truth slicing through the room's bureaucracy. The board members shifted, their neutral masks cracking under the weight of his conviction. Naomi leaned forward, her navy suit a shield, her voice calm but unyielding, like a river carving stone. "This isn't about rebellion," she said, her eyes locking onto Granger's. "It's about return. We're not breaking tradition. We're reminding people why it mattered in the first place." Granger tapped his pen, the sound sharp in the quiet. "The student showcases, the open invitations, that's not how this region operates," he said, his tone clipped, authoritative. Master Kenji's voice broke the tension, slow and worn but steady as stone. "Then maybe it's time the region caught up." His words hung in the air, a challenge wrapped in wisdom, and the room stilled, as if the walls themselves felt the shift. A soft knock at the door shattered the silence. Granger frowned, his irritation palpable. "We're in the middle," he began, but the door opened and Daisy stepped inside, her small hands trembling as she clutched a printed photo. "I know I'm not supposed to be here," she said, her voice shaking but resolute, a spark of courage in her wide eyes. "But I wanted to say something." Naomi stood, her heart leaping, a mix of pride and fear tightening her chest. "Daisy," she breathed, but Joe's gentle touch on her arm stopped her. "Let her," he said, his voice soft but certain, a father trusting his daughter's strength. Daisy faced the board, holding up the photo, a snapshot of herself 6 months ago, curled on a bench outside the dojo, her backpack half off, her eyes red with the sting of exclusion. "This was me before," she said, her voice small but unwavering. Then she pulled out a second photo, from the invitational, her mid-bow, cheeks flushed with pride. "And this is me now. I didn't win, but I didn't hide. That's what Coach Joe taught me, that even if I'm small or scared or slow, I still get to take up space. I still get to be seen." She looked at the panel, her gaze steady, piercing. "Isn't that what martial arts is for?" The silence that followed was profound, the kind that humbles grown men, stripping away pretense. Naomi stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Daisy's shoulder, guiding her back to the door with a tenderness that belied her steel resolve. As they left, Granger folded his hands, his voice subdued. "We'll deliberate," he said. "You'll receive our decision by Monday." Naomi nodded, her voice steady. "Thank you." But as she and Joe stepped into the sunlight outside, her breath trembled, betraying her calm. "I don't know if that was enough," she whispered, her eyes searching his. Joe looked down at her, his gaze warm, unshaken. "You showed them the heart of the place. If they don't see it now, they never will." She paused, the weight of his words settling. "And if they revoke our certification?" He shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Then we build something bigger." Naomi glanced at him, half smiling, a spark of hope flickering. "You really think we could?" Joe looked back at the dojo, its sterile facade hiding a heartbeat it had forgotten. "I think we already are." Across the street, Daisy waved from a bench, her white belt flapping in the wind like a flag. Simple, unadorned, but standing tall, a symbol of resilience. It happened on a Wednesday, abrupt and cold as a winter gust. An email from the Regional Martial Arts Board landed in Naomi's inbox. Its subject line a blunt verdict: accreditation revoked. By noon, the Sinclair Martial Arts Academy was a ghost of itself. Access cards deactivated, mats rolled up by state order, the regional seal stripped from the wall. Naomi's name was erased from the list of licensed instructors. The locks changed, the server for student records suspended. No appeal, no explanation beyond a vague charge of noncompliance. Joe learned of it when his name vanished from the internal directory, his phone screen a blank white void. He stood frozen, the message looping in his mind. In the interest of preserving regional martial arts standards, Sinclair Dojo's certification has been terminated. Naomi sat on the floor of her office, knees drawn up, her blazer discarded on the desk like a shed skin. The letter trembled in her hands, its words of betrayal sharper than any blade. "They didn't even listen," she whispered, her voice cracking. "They watched Daisy speak. They heard us. And they were never going to listen," Joe said, his voice steady but heavy, like a man who'd seen too many battles lost to bureaucracy. "They were just waiting for the right moment to make us look like we lost." Naomi shook her head, her eyes burning with unshed tears. "This isn't about us anymore. It's about every kid who thought this place was safe." The dojo echoed with emptiness, its light colder, as if the building itself mourned its betrayal. Joe picked up a stray white belt left on a bench, turning it over in his hands, its simplicity a stark contrast to the weight it carried. "Funny," he said quietly, his voice tinged with irony. "This little thing used to scare me more than any battlefield." Naomi looked up, her brow furrowing. "Why?" "Because out there," Joe said, nodding to the world beyond the glass doors, "I knew what I was fighting. Here I had to face myself." They sat in silence, the weight of their shared loss settling like dust. Then Naomi stood, her face hardening, not with bitterness, but with a fire that burned brighter than defeat. "I'm not letting them erase us," she said, her voice fierce, resolute. Joe raised an eyebrow, a spark of curiosity in his eyes. "I'm serious," she said, her gaze unwavering. "They can take the license, the registry, the title, but they can't take the truth, and they can't take the kids." He watched her, seeing not the CEO but Naomi, the woman who'd once stood before her husband's casket and vowed to carry a dream bigger than grief. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She moved to the front of the dojo, unlocking the side door to the old maintenance wing, where unused storage rooms gathered dust like forgotten promises. She pushed open a door, revealing cracked tiles, exposed wires, and cobwebs clinging to corners. "Perfect," she said, her voice alight with defiance. "Let them shut us down on paper. We'll build a home with our hands." Joe grinned, a flicker of mischief breaking through. "You know we don't have insurance for unauthorized squat training, right?" She turned to him, her smirk sharp. "Then we call it something else. Not a dojo, not a program." "What then?" Naomi knelt in the center of the room, drawing a line through the dust with her finger, her voice steady as a vow. "A circle. Old as time, no corners, no ranks, just people who show up again and again until the fear runs out of breath." Joe blinked, the simplicity of it striking deep. "You realize this is probably illegal." She laughed, a spark of rebellion in her eyes. "You fought in Afghanistan. I think we can survive a few code violations." That night Joe returned home late, the chill of October biting at his skin. Daisy's room glowed with a soft light, and he peeked in. She was reading, or pretending to, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. "You okay, kiddo?" he asked, his voice soft. She looked up, her voice small. "Did they close it?" Joe nodded, the truth heavy. "Yeah." Daisy swallowed, her eyes glistening. "So we don't have a dojo anymore?" He sat on the edge of her bed, his presence a quiet anchor. "We don't have a building," he said, tapping a finger to her chest. "But that's not what a dojo is. It's here, where people come together to stand taller, listen better, fight without hurting." That doesn't disappear just because someone shuts off the lights. Daisy was quiet, her gaze searching. I don't want it to be over, she whispered. Joe wrapped an arm around her, his voice steady, warm. It's not over, he said. It's just changing shape. Later that week, they gathered in the old storage room. Naomi, Joe, Kenji, and 6 students who cared nothing for certifications or seals. No mats, no sound system, just breath, just presence. A circle forged in defiance of a world that tried to silence them. Naomi stood at the heart of the dusty storage room, her voice a beacon cutting through the quiet. We're not here to earn rank, she said, her words ringing with purpose, steady as a pulse. We're here to reclaim rhythm, to remember why we move, why we still matter. She nodded to Joe, her eyes carrying a quiet trust. He stepped forward, hands open, his presence a steady anchor. Bow not to me, he said, his voice calm but resonant, like a vow spoken to the soul. Bow to the part of yourself that showed up, even when it was easier to stay home. The small circle, Naomi, Joe, Kenji, and 6 students, bowed, their breaths aligning in a silent promise. In that moment, a new dojo was born, not on paper, but in purpose, a spark kindled in defiance of a world that tried to snuff it out. At 6:12 a.m., the shrill buzz of Joe's phone shattered the quiet of his kitchen, where he stood, half asleep, frying eggs. The number was unknown, but a cold knot in his gut urged him to answer. Coach Joe, a breathless voice gasped. It's Rachel, Daisy's mom. There's been an accident. Time collapsed into static, the world narrowing to a single jagged truth. Daisy had been walking to school with a friend when a delivery truck ran a stop sign. The friend walked away unscathed. Daisy didn't. By the time Joe reached the hospital, the sun lingered below the horizon, painting the sky a soft gray, as if the morning had forgotten its colors. He burst into the ER waiting area, his hoodie crumpled from sleep, his heart racing faster than his steps. Rachel sat slumped in a chair, her face pale, eyes wide with a fear that mirrored his own. She's in surgery, she said, her voice hollow, barely lifting her gaze. Compound fracture, femur. Joe sank beside her, his body heavy, his mind a whirlwind of guilt and dread. She's going to be okay, he said, more to himself than to her, a desperate mantra against the silence. Rachel exhaled, her breath shaky. The doctor said the bone might heal, but she may not regain full range of motion. Not enough for sports. The words landed like a silent explosion, final and unyielding, shattering the fragile hope Joe clung to. He stared at the floor, the tiles blurring. I should have walked her, he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of a father's guilt. Rachel turned to him, her eyes sharp with urgency. Joe, no, don't do that. I promised her, he murmured, his voice barely audible. Promised her she could keep growing, keep standing. She still can, Rachel said, her voice firm but trembling. Joe didn't answer, the weight of her words lost in the storm of his thoughts. Hours later, Naomi arrived, her thick gray coat wrapped tight against the chill, her face bare of makeup, raw and human. She said nothing, simply sat between them, one hand resting on Rachel's shoulder, the other on Joe's, her silence a quiet strength, a leader's presence that needed no words. When the surgeon emerged, Joe stood before he realized it, his heart pounding. She's stable, the doctor said, his voice steady but cautious. But recovery will be long. Months of physical therapy. She'll need support, a community. Naomi's voice was soft but unshakable. She has one. A week passed before Daisy opened her eyes, her small form dwarfed by the hospital bed. The first thing she saw was a faded poster Joe had tacked to the wall. A photo of the dojo's old mat, its chalk outlines still faintly visible from Mason's rigid drills. Her voice came out thin, fragile. Coach? Joe leaned forward, gripping her hand, his heart catching at the sound. Right here, kiddo. She blinked, her eyes searching his. Did I fall wrong? He let out a shaky laugh, tears brimming. No, the world just threw a bad punch. She was quiet, her gaze drifting to the ceiling. Will I still be able to kick? Joe swallowed, his throat tight, refusing to lie. Not for a while. Someday, maybe. I don't know. Daisy stared upward, processing, then whispered, then I guess it's time to learn something new. Joe blinked, caught off guard. Like what? Her faint smile was a spark in the sterile room. Balance. Days later, Naomi stood in Joe's cramped kitchen, stirring instant ramen while Daisy slept in the next room, her wheelchair a new constant by her side. She's tougher than both of us, Naomi said, her voice warm with admiration. Joe nodded, his eyes distant. She doesn't know how to quit. Naomi leaned against the counter, watching him, her gaze soft but piercing. Neither do you. He paused, the spoon hovering over the pot, steam rising like a fleeting ghost. I'm not the man I used to be, he said, his voice low, heavy with doubt. That's not what makes you powerful, Naomi replied, stepping closer, her words steady, unwavering. It's that you kept showing up. After he was gone, after she got sick, after they shut us down, you kept showing up anyway. Joe looked down, his voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes I feel like I'm held together with duct tape and borrowed time. Naomi's smile was gentle, her hand reaching up to touch his chest, a fleeting gesture that carried weight. That's how most heroes start, she said, her voice a quiet promise. You know, for someone who doesn't wear a uniform anymore, you still carry command. Joe met her gaze, a flicker of warmth breaking through. And for someone who stopped believing in happy endings, you're starting to look like one. That weekend, the circle gathered again. No flyers, no fanfare. Just word of mouth, drawing more kids, more parents, people who craved healing over badges. Naomi opened the session, her voice clear, resonant. This isn't about competition, she said. It's about coming back to life. Joe led the warm-up, his movements simple, gentle breaths, controlled steps, a rhythm of resilience. At the end, he stepped to the center, his voice steady, carrying a truth he'd only begun to understand. I used to think strength was measured by how much weight you could carry, he said, the room stilling under his words. But lately I've learned it's measured by what you're willing to let go. Pride, guilt, fear. His eyes found Daisy, seated in her wheelchair, her gaze alert, alive. She's not less because she can't stand. She's more because she still wants to. Daisy gave him a thumbs up, her smile a beacon. The group's quiet laughter warmed the room, the moment soft, sacred. Naomi closed her eyes, letting the warmth settle deep, whispering almost to herself. This is what my husband dreamed of. Not a business, not a brand, but a place where broken things could begin again. Joe heard her, and in the quiet they both felt it. Not an ending, but a rebirth. Snow fell outside in slow, silent spirals, dusting the world in a gentle hush. Inside the borrowed room behind the old post office, folding chairs encircled a makeshift mat. The circle had outgrown its storage closet roots. No budget, no heat, but brimming with life. Kids stretched, parents shared thermoses, and battery-operated candles flickered like determined spirits. At the center sat Daisy, her wheelchair woven into the circle, no longer apart. She wore a fresh guy, a gift from Kenji, her name stitched above her heart, a quiet vow. Joe stood beside her, holding a belt. Not black, not white, but a deep slate gray, the color of rain before a bloom, of strength before light. This isn't part of any sanctioned system, he said to the group, his voice steady, resonant. But today, we make our own. He knelt before Daisy, their eyes level, his gaze warm with pride. You've taught us more in these past months than some learn in a lifetime. About standing when you can't, leading without shouting, carrying weight without legs. Daisy blinked back tears, her small frame trembling with emotion. This belt isn't for technique, Joe continued. It's for truth. You don't have to wear it if you don't want to. Her voice was small but unwavering. I do. He tied it gently around her waist, the fabric settling like a sacred promise. Naomi watched from the corner, arms folded, her heart swelling with pride, longing, and a sense of completion. She stepped forward, clearing her throat, her voice steady but thick with emotion. I have something too, she said, pulling a small wooden box from her coat. Inside gleamed a polished pin, circular, engraved with a phoenix rising from a belt knot. "This was my husband's design," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "He never got to award it. But I think he'd have chosen you." Joe blinked, caught off guard, as Naomi fastened the pin to his sleeve. "This isn't a title," she said, her eyes meeting his, shimmering with gratitude. "It's a thank you for carrying what couldn't be carried, for showing up when the room went dark. You didn't just rebuild the dojo, you rebuilt me." A pause hung between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Joe whispered, his voice raw. "That day I showed up, mop in hand, thinking I was invisible. Did you really not recognize me?" Naomi hesitated, her gaze dropping, voice tight. "I knew. After 10 minutes, I knew. Why didn't you say anything?" She looked down, her breath catching. "Because I was scared I'd hope again." Joe reached out, gently lifting her chin, their eyes locking. "And now," Naomi swallowed, a faint smile breaking through. "Now I hope every day." A cough broke the moment, but its warmth lingered, filling the room like breath in winter. Kenji stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. "I believe it's time for our final ceremony." The group turned to a blank canvas rolled out against the wall, its emptiness a promise waiting to be filled. Naomi stood before the blank canvas, its emptiness a silent invitation. "Instead of a photo or certificate," she said, her voice steady but warm, "we're making a map, a living one, tracing everyone who's passed through this circle, not for rank, but for presence." She handed out brushes and ink, her movements deliberate, a quiet call to action. One by one, kids and parents stepped forward, their hands leaving prints, names, and words of courage on the canvas, a tapestry of resilience. When Joe's turn came, he didn't hesitate. He dipped his palm in deep blue paint, pressing it firmly to the corner, the mark solid, unyielding. Below it, he scrawled in the steady strokes, "Strength is choosing to stay." Daisy rolled forward next, her grin bright despite the weight of her cast. "I want to leave a sign with my foot," she declared, sparking a ripple of laughter through the room. Master Kenji knelt beside her, his gentle hands guiding her cast to the canvas, leaving a wobbly gray imprint. Above it, Daisy wrote in bold, uneven letters, "Still kicking." The room's warmth grew, a quiet celebration of her defiance. Naomi's turn came last. She didn't leave a handprint. Instead, she drew a weathered photo from her pocket, its edges soft from years of folding. It captured her late husband in his GI, laughing, his arm around a younger Naomi in street clothes, their eyes closed in a moment of unscripted joy. Too fleeting, too precious. She pinned it to the canvas's top, no caption needed, just legacy, raw and radiant, a testament to a dream that refused to fade. Later that night, as the room emptied and chairs were folded, Joe and Naomi stood outside, their breath clouding in the biting cold. Snow swirled in soft, endless spirals, dusting the world in quiet reverence. "Do you think they'll ever give us back our certification?" Joe asked, his voice low, tinged with practicality. Naomi met his gaze, her eyes steady, fierce. "We built something better than permission." He nodded, a faint smile breaking through. "Still, it doesn't hurt to be official." She smirked, a spark of defiance in her expression. "Maybe someday." They stood in silence, the snow falling like a gentle absolution. Naomi turned to him, her voice soft but deliberate. "You know, if this were a movie, this is where we'd kiss." Joe's smile was warm, unguarded. "We're not in a movie." "No," she said, stepping closer, her breath mingling with his in the frosty air. "We're in something better." She rested her head against his chest, not kissing, not pretending, just breathing, whole, alive, together. The moment was quiet, earned, a fragile bridge between two souls who'd found each other in the ruins. A year later, the snow returned, but it no longer felt like a weight to brace against. It was a memory coming home. The building at the corner of Maple and 6th, once a faded hardware store, now glowed with new life, its sign proclaiming the circle. Community, courage, connection. Laughter echoed through freshly painted walls, a small library nook in one corner, brimming with books on resilience, mindfulness, and martial arts philosophy. Above it hung Daisy's framed sketches, her 11-year-old fire captured in bold, vibrant lines. Joe stood at the back of the main hall, adjusting the gloves of a new student, Marcus, a quiet 10-year-old with a fierce spark in his eyes. "Coach," Marcus whispered, "you think I could be a black belt someday?" Joe smiled, his voice steady, warm. "That depends. Are you willing to fail more times than most people are willing to try?" Marcus nodded, his gaze resolute, understanding more than his age suggested. He bowed and Joe bowed back, a silent pact sealed in respect. Across the room, Naomi oversaw parents helping their kids stretch, her soft gray sweater a contrast to the sharp suits of her past. A lanyard hung around her neck, bearing the phoenix pin Joe once wore. Now hers, a symbol of their shared journey. Her eyes met Joe's across the bustling hall. He winked and she shook her head, half amused, half smitten, a quiet spark passing between them. In the corner, Master Kenji sipped tea, his eyes tracing the scene with the pride of a gardener, watching his blooms unfold. Daisy rolled into the center of the mat, her braces replaced by lightweight exo-supports, visible beneath her pants but no longer a cage, a scaffold for her unstoppable spirit. Joe clapped his hands, his voice cutting through the hum. "Everyone, gather up!" The students formed a semicircle, their attention unwavering. Naomi stepped beside him, holding a small box, her presence a quiet anchor. Joe addressed the group, his voice resonant, carrying the weight of a year's journey. "Today marks the 1-year anniversary of our first circle meeting," he said, gesturing to the walls, now alive with color and memory. "Back then we had nothing. No mats, no certificates, just a cracked floor and a handful of people who believed broken things could still hold weight." His eyes found Daisy, her gaze bright, unyielding. "Now we've grown roots. We've earned something better than rank. Trust." Naomi opened the box, revealing a black belt, carefully embroidered with Daisy's name and the kanji for honor through healing. The room hushed, a sacred stillness settling over them. Joe turned to Daisy, his voice soft but unwavering. "This isn't about kicking higher or striking harder. It's about the day you stood for someone else when your own legs couldn't. About showing up when it hurt, about never letting anyone define your finish line." Daisy's voice trembled, her eyes glistening. "Will it still count, even if it's not official?" Joe knelt, their eyes level, his smile warm with certainty. "It counts because we say it does, because you lived every lesson this belt represents." He tied it around her waist, his hands slow, reverent, the fabric settling like a vow kept. Daisy reached up, hugging him fiercely. "Thanks for not giving up on me," she whispered, her voice muffled against his shoulder. Joe squeezed her hand, his voice thick. "Thanks for never letting me forget why I started." Applause erupted, warm and honest, filling the room with a vibration of shared triumph. Not loud, not flashy, but real. Later at the window, Naomi and Joe stood as snowflakes dusted the sidewalk, parents loading kids into cars, thermoses labeled "Be kind" or "Be quiet" passing between hands. "Do you miss it?" Naomi asked, her voice soft. "The old dojo, the name, the legacy?" Joe looked out over the block, his gaze steady. "No, legacies aren't names. They're ripples." Naomi nodded, her smile soft. "So, what do we call this chapter?" "A beginning," Joe said, stepping closer, his voice low, certain. She smiled, her eyes glinting. "You always were better at endings." He took her hand, his voice raw, unguarded. "Naomi, I think I'm in love with you." She didn't flinch, didn't joke, just squeezed his hand, her voice steady. "You're not the only one." She leaned in, their kiss soft, unhurried, not cinematic but earned, a quiet promise sealed in the snow's gentle fall. Behind them, Daisy wheeled up beside Kenji, who handed her a notebook. "What's this?" she asked, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Your first coaching journal," Kenji said, his voice warm with pride. "If you're going to be the youngest assistant sensei this place has ever had, you'd better be ready." Daisy grinned, wide and fearless, opening the notebook to its first page. In bold block letters, she'd written, "The belt doesn't make you unbreakable. It proves you already were." Kenji chuckled, his eyes twinkling. "You'll do just fine, kid." As the lights dimmed and the last stragglers headed home, the circle remained open, a haven for those who needed one more minute of safety, for kids seeking courage, for parents searching for words, for a world that, despite its broken places, still found ways to bow, rise, and begin again.